This is a crazy story. It sounds dramatic, but I do think if they had never met, the 20th century would look very different in terms of what kind of writing and storytelling and fantasy world building looked like.
That was John Hendrix, a New York Times best-selling author and illustrator. His latest book is a graphic novel called The Mythmakers, The Remarkable Fellowship of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. The Mythmakers tells the story of Lewis and Tolkien, two famous authors of books that have sold hundreds of millions of copies. They include Lewis's book, The Chronicles of Narnia, and Tolkien's book, The Lord of the Rings. Today we have fantasy and science fiction everywhere, in books, computer games, and movies. But in the 1920s and the 1930s, no one was doing this. It's not exaggerating to say that C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien helped to create popular culture today. A graphic novel like The Mythmakers is text combined with images and comics. I was fascinated with The Mythmakers because every page is a beautiful illustrated work of art. These images are all in service of a broader narrative about myth, legend, and the creative and collaborative process. In this episode, John Hendrix and I talk about his new book and about his own creative process. I'm here today with author and illustrator John Hendrix. John, thank you so much for joining me on The Science of Creativity.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here.
I hope we're going to talk a lot about your new book, which is called The Mythmakers. And I read it very closely. I loved it. It's a beautiful book. I actually even read the acknowledgments at the end and the notes. And at the very end, you say there's so much information that you might have put in the book about J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. And you say that the hardest task was curation, what you decided to leave out. What do you mean by that when you're writing a book like this? What do you mean by curation, and why was it hard?
Well, there's so many things in any one story to tell. And something that readers should know, something that I have learned over the years of making books, is that all history is fiction of a kind, in that you are creating a story out of the facts. And of course, those choices serve an editorial point of view, and you're trying to be objective. But this is why when I begin my research, I read a lot of biographies, because they're all doing this. They're leaving things out. They're emphasizing other things in order to create a kind of thesis about the subject. So in this case, Lewis and Tolkien had so many interesting things inside of their life story. I didn't really mention Pauline Baynes, the illustrator, how important she was to their work. I was very influenced by her. I didn't talk about Till We Have Faces, and that was Lewis's favorite book and one that he basically wrote with Joy Davidman. And again, that seems insane to leave that out. But again, there was so many choices I had to make. Honestly, I didn't want this book to be 300 pages. And I started with a target of 176. And then from there, I just kept adding signatures.
Your book is about the relationship between two famous authors, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. For our listeners who don't know about who those people are, could you give us a quick summary of who they are and their relationship?
Yeah, so J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis were scholars at Oxford. Lewis was a Don, a fellow, and Tolkien was a chair professor. But of course, they're really known to our world today as the authors of Middle-earth and Narnia, The Lord of the Rings trilogy, The Hobbit, and of course, The Chronicles of Narnia. So they come to us today as these sort of seminal fantasy authors. But it's important to remember that in the midst of their own lives, that is not the label that they carried for themselves. They were faculty at Oxford and were busy with very different activities than, concocting the greatest fantasy novels of the 20th century. That was really something they did more or less by accident.
Well, that is interesting. When you read the book, you learn a lot about myth, and you learn about the various theories of myth, that both of these authors were influenced by. So I learned a lot about myth and legend and the history and definition of those terms. So, what do you mean by mythology?
Well, I think the first thing that readers should know is that when I say myth, when the book mentions myth, a casual reader might, in their mind, correlate that with something that is quote unquote untrue or something that is a fabrication. So if I was to say the book of Genesis is a myth, there's a certain segment of people that would be very upset by that concept. And that's really not what the word means in the context of this story. So, myth, when we're using it here, is a kind of archetypal story that to the audience, to the listener, always said something true about their world and it revealed something true to the audience. And so when ancient peoples were listening to a myth, they did not think this is a fun fictional story for entertainment. But this is a story that maybe serves to underscore a particular ritual. Maybe it enlivens something about the history of their world or their origins, or maybe it preserves a kind of belief or a truism about the things that they did and understood. So, again, when we take the idea of myth, we're really saying these are stories that follow a particular pattern and do a particular task. And they're more concerned with truth than they are fact. So that is where I start the book. Is I have these two avatars, lion and wizard, and these are two characters that were just chosen totally at random that work as kind of avatars for Lewis and Tolkien in the book, and they take us through a journey into the hall of myth and epic where we begin to learn the definition of myth, and then because of that definition, we can then understand what Lewis and Tolkien were trying to do in their stories.
I should mention that this is a graphic novel. You have all this information in it about theories of myth and how they influenced these very influential authors, but it's not just an academic text. So when you say that you have two avatars and they're going through a hall, you actually have a visual representation of this amazing space, and they actually walk through the door. You have images for all of these things. I guess I could say they're visual metaphors. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And yes, despite this book having a talking lion in it, I do want it to sit in the nonfiction section of the library. So, yes, I am not a scholar. I am an artist. And I think of these books that I do, these graphic novels that are nonfiction oriented, as works of art more than scholarship. But I really am careful to make sure that I'm representing the facts of their life and beyond that, the sort of sweeping story of their life correctly and something that they themselves would recognize as true.
It is a beautiful book. It's definitely a work of art and an amazing amount of art. I'm looking at my Kindle version right now, and I can see 205 illustrated pages. That is just an immense amount of work. How long did it take you to generate this book?
Yes, it was a 5-year project, and I began my reading sort of ahead of that. So, it was probably closer to 6 years. I'm a very slow reader. The research takes me a long time, and the writing was extremely. My previous graphic novel was about Dietrich Bonhoeffer and was really a kind of singular biography. This was a dual biography in a way, alongside a sort of shorthand history of myth and the history of the fairy tale and the novel and where did fantasy literature come from. So it really was kind of a sweeping scope that I was trying to place into one book.
And the books by these authors that are the focus of your story, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, they've sold hundreds of millions of copies. Lord of the Rings, you say in your book that it sold 150 million copies. A lot of them were sold in the 1960s and the 1970s, and that's when I encountered it. I really loved Lord of the Rings in middle school and in high school, which for me, that was the 1970s. So I guess I'm interested, who is your book written for? It seems like it would be anyone who's interested in those novels would want to read your book and learn more about those authors. Is that right?
Yeah, I really write for middle grade audiences. And so, of course, adults can read it because I think the act of translation, of taking something complicated and making it legible, I think that is a skill, or that is an activity that almost any audience can appreciate. And it's why we like listening to a good TED Talk or something where someone takes their expertise and really translates it for you so that you have this sort of graspable concept. And so I make what I call usable histories for people. And the audience I have in mind, I mean, for this book is really like a 14-year-old kid who just was assigned like Beowulf and is struggling to get through it. Or maybe they have read fantasy books and wondered, where does this concept of the sort of medieval past come from? And these are things that I think you would not get a 14-year-old to pick up an academic text delivered the same information, but a graphic novel that starts with kind of a dungeon crawl and allows the reader to go on some of the adventures while learning some of this material. Again, I'm making this book kind of for me when I was that age. Like this is the way I like to learn. And so if that's an adult that also enjoys visual learning styles, then you're going to like this book.
A major theme of your book is that C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien were fascinated by myths and theories of myths, and different scholars who had written about the structures of myths. So would you say that the books that they wrote, were they trying to create modern myths of a sort?
Yes, for sure. Tolkien very explicitly said he wanted to create a mythology for England that was about England. And you would say, probably, if you're not familiar with this story, oh, well, but they had King Arthur. Well, King Arthur was not English. I know it was eventually set in England in our memory, or Robin Hood or something like that. But those were, French romances. The chivalric tales were not English. And so if you read the Lord of the Rings books through the lens of Tolkien writing a love letter to the landscape of England, that's also why the Shire is so important, and why that is the sort of emotional home that is the center heartbeat of what the story is trying to preserve and protect. And that's a love letter to the countryside that he grew up around, and that he wanted a tale that enshrined England. And Lewis, I think what he was interested in myth was not so much these courtly tales that enshrined a particular place. What I think Lewis was searching for was that feeling of joy, of being transported when he read a story. He called it the feeling of northernness, of distant mountains, of ancient tales, and of being swept up in a grand epic. And of course, that was the thing that really led him to embrace Christianity, was identifying that feeling was rooted in the Christian story. And so he was chasing myth for actually a similar reason to Tolkien, because Tolkien was also obsessed with joy inside of stories. But they both came at it from a little bit of a different angle. And one of the things I do in the book is try to help you understand their creative similarities and their creative differences, because they did make work in just almost opposite ways while shooting for the same destination.
And we're talking about Lewis and Tolkien, who were both professors at the University of Oxford. And they met once or twice a week, I think. So they were interacting quite a bit. Do you think they talked a lot about myth, or did they share with each other their ideas that they were having for the myths that they were creating?
Oh yes, there's lots of letters. There's lots of documented conversations. I highlight some of those in the book. One of the kind of interesting ones that maybe people don't know is they met together at Eagle and Child, and were talking about how there just are no stories that are written for them that are modern fairy tales that are serious, or fantasy or science fiction that is serious and popular. So they kind of dared each other to do this task, and they flipped a coin. And tails, you'd get time travel; heads, you'd get space travel. And Lewis got space travel, and wrote the space trilogy almost kind of instantly, which of course enraged Tolkien. He was a very different kind of writer, and he wrote this story a time travel story called The Lost Road about a father and son. And anyway, it was kind of a disaster. It never worked. He abandoned it pretty quickly. But he did sort of take the Numenor myth inside of the Silmarillion, if you know that story, comes out of The Lost Road, which came from this coin flip. So, and again, it's just important to underscore that they did not know they were the C.S. Lewis and the J.R.R. Tolkien. They were two friends at a pub doing basically a hobby together. And these two people sold together 250 million copies of the books that came out of this private coin flip, basically. So this is a crazy story. I mean, it really is. It sounds dramatic, but I do think if they had never met, the 20th century would look very different in terms of what kind of writing and storytelling and fantasy world building looked like.
And we're talking about their relationship being in the 1920s and 1930s, and they're professors at Oxford. They're not professors of writing mythical stories.
Fantasy, yeah, they're not fantasy professors, right?
Right, because you said it was a hobby for them. So what did they do for their day jobs?
Well, Tolkien was a language expert. You know, he was the chair of Anglo-Saxon at Merton. And then, when they first met, he was at Pembroke, but then went to Merton. And, Tolkien was, his special was medieval literature. And, he wrote, of course, many scholarly, they both wrote a lot of scholarly documents that, are basically unread by the common public today because they're just known for these side projects that they did. And of course, Lewis himself was basically, maybe this is a little strong, but because his works that he was doing in the peak of his career, the theological works and then Narnia, this was not welcomed at Oxford. This was not a good use of your time as a scholar. So let alone writing theological works where he did not go to seminary, and then writing extremely popular theological works. That was almost the worst case. So there was definitely a sense that he was passed over at Oxford for a chair, Lewis was never a professor at Oxford. He was a fellow or a don, but he did not get a chair until he had to go to the rival Cambridge towards the end of his life. And so Tolkien was actually very instrumental in helping him get that chair at Cambridge. And he felt like he was unfairly passed over at Oxford for many years because of this kind of bias against his popularity.
So they were supposed to be doing serious scholarly work because they're professors and because they're at Oxford. And I think you say in your book that they feel something like outsiders, like what they're doing. They know what they're doing is not welcome. It's not something, in the 1920s, you didn't have a lot of adults writing this kind of material. So they really did feel like outsiders.
Yeah, that's right. And Tolkien, he worked on doing the definitions in some of the words of the W's. I mentioned that in the book. That was in the Oxford English Dictionary. So he was a language expert. And of course, you see that in Lord of the Rings exists because he wanted an in-world story for the phrase, "A star shined on the hour of our meeting." He wanted a place and a world and a people where that could make some sense. And so he invented a language to say that phrase in. And inside of that phrase, he invented a people that would have that language and that would have a story about Arendelle, the star, right? And so he worked backwards from the idea of what could a language tell us about a people. So he was very analytical in the way that he built his world out. And Lewis, his working methodology was much more about mythos or story, whereas Tolkien was more about the logos, the word, the order, the concept. He built insane like weather charts and moon phase charts and character sets and deep histories. The Silmarillion is basically like the Old Testament of Middle Earth. That just is there as a foundational text for when in Lord of the Rings, somebody mentions very casually in conversation a person or an event or a moment of the deep past. It feels like you're sort of stumbling in to this rich text that you don't have access to in a way. And that was part of what he wanted.
When I read their novels, and I've been reading them my whole life, it just made a big influence on me, especially The Lord of the Rings. It reminds me, as these adults are creating fantasy worlds that are very rich, maybe it's a planet you've never heard of. It's certainly a landscape you've never seen. And there's individuals in it that you've never heard of, and they have abilities that humans don't have. There's a lot of creativity. And researchers have studied children and adolescents and have found that actually a lot of children and adolescents create their own imaginary worlds. I'm looking at research by Michelle Root Bernstein and Robert Root Bernstein at Michigan State University, where creativity researchers call this world play, and they associate it with greater creativity. So I'm wondering, you yourself, did you have anything like this when you were growing up? Did you create fantasy worlds yourself?
Yeah, I did personally. Well, Tolkien thought this was basically the highest order of human creativity. He called it subcreation, and he felt it was a kind of holy act to, because God, in his view, is the only person who can create fully ex nihilo, from nothing, something. He said human beings cannot do this, with one exception. We can act like God in our imagination, and we can build these worlds out in our imagination. And in so doing, we image God when we do it. We are acting like our creator. We make in the manner in which we were made. That was Tolkien's belief. And so myth making was a holy act to him. And so all that to say is, yes, I did this same thing. No one told me to do it. I longed to do it. I made my own comics and stories as a kid that had their own worlds, their own characters. I really loved building my own board games. I loved creating maps of places and potential stories that could happen inside those worlds. I did a lot of taking an existing universe and riffing on it and extending it, adding Star Wars characters to the Mos Eisley Cantina. Role-playing games were really fun for me as a child because it gave me that, both the visual opportunity and the story opportunity to extend an imaginary world. And I think that's some of the height of creativity in young people.
Did you know at that time when you were creating those things, did you know that you were going to be an illustrator when you grew up?
No, I did not. I mean, I knew when I was, college bound that I wanted to do art, but even the category of illustration was something I had to come to understand later. I just thought if you wanted to draw for a living, you probably should do comics. So that was my goal. And then I got to college and met a faculty member, Barry Fitzgerald, at the University of Kansas, and he helped me to see illustration as a category. And that was really when I figured out I was an illustrator, that there was stuff that I loved in the activity of illustration that was the thing I loved and longed to do the most. And so that's where it eventually went for me.
And you do illustration of all sorts, all over the place. You don't only do graphic novels. Could you say a little bit more about some of the other illustration work you've done?
Yeah, I work in editorial contexts for the New York Times or the New Yorker or Rolling Stone or Washington Post, venues that call me with a story, and I do an image to go with that. I have done visual reporting for the New York Times, where I've been sent to a location and I draw and write together as a way to take the readers of the Times with me into new and unusual locations. I've done advertising and book jackets for adult works, but mostly young adult literature. So yeah, illustration as a career has a lot of facets to it. But most of the stuff at the end of the day that I'm working on are authored books that I'm writing myself.
And a book like this, of course, if you have complete control over it, you don't have a client that you're working for. You can take any paths you like while you're working on this book, right?
Yeah, I mean, I have an editor, and so I'm always I'm always hoping the editor agrees with my choices. But yeah, basically, I do not send a manuscript to someone finished. I have worked for Abrams now long enough that they essentially trust me, and I can pitch them the concept of a project, the story outline, And then they let me work on it, and I send them something in progress to which they, then give me suggestions. And so, yeah, as a working concept, yeah, I basically have a really, really wide open canvas when I start a project.
You said you'd worked on this book for 4 or 5 years. Could you say a little bit more about your creative process over that time? How did you approach it? And how did it change while you were working on it?
Well, when you read the book, it feels like it was really a clear idea from start to finish. Almost any work of art is like this. I say this about Tolkien all the time. He didn't know he was writing the seminal fantasy work of the 20th century. Tolkien was in the midst of art making that for him was a struggle. And like for me, it's a struggle too. So in the midst of making a book like this, it's just a total mess. Like I'm trying things, I'm removing things, I'm doing sketches, I'm doing a sketch draft. And, the first 2.5 years of the project were a huge lift just to get it to the point where it's a sketch dummy that has all the text in place and that all the choices are made about what the story is. Then I have to actually like begin the making of the art for it, which is, that's another whole hurdle. So these books are very time consuming, and they're, fun in theory, but in practice, it is a lot of struggle.
The book has 205 pages, and each one of them is really its own separate work of art. And you said that you just started out by laying out all of the pages, you had all the words. Was it 205 pages before you started doing the illustrations?
So my goal was 176, and every time I came back to it, I added another signature, which in publishing, you got to add 16 pages at a time. So I would add 16 pages, 16, 16, finally got to 224 is where I said, I just can't go beyond that. And so, yes, you do have to think about page count, especially in a book like this, where the page design is so critical. It's not like if I want to add a paragraph somewhere, I just reflow the text and they add a page at the end of it. So yes, there's a kind of Jenga tower that I'm building, and it's just very difficult to move things around once you get to a certain point. So that is a challenge of these kind of books, the formatting, the sketching, and then finally the realizing that in final art.
For that first 2.5 years, when you were saying it's a kind of a mess and there's things all over the place, could you give an example of a path that you took for a little while and you ended up not using, where you turned away?
Yeah, well, probably the easiest example is in this book, there are essentially illustrated footnotes in the back where you can follow the narrators through these portals, kind of like a choose your own adventure book, to learn additional material about the story. One is the history of where myth comes from. One is the origins of the fairy tale. And these were initially inside the story. And I liked that they were surrounding the actual narrative because I thought it gave really critical context. On the first read, my editor felt like those passages were extremely dense and bogged down the sweeping narrative. And he was right. So we moved those as these sort of illustrated portals to the back of the book, which actually many people have really found quite fun and a nice way to like, hey, if you just want to get through the story, just keep on trucking. And you can come back and read the footnotes later.
I'm glad you told me that because I didn't realize that. And I read all the way to the end, and then I read the portals, which I thought of sort of like appendixes, right? I didn't jump to them during the reading of the story. But that makes sense. If you had all these right in line with the story, it might slow down the narrative itself.
Yeah, and especially considering the audience. I mean, I am writing for younger minds. And one of the things my books get criticized for, but which I'm doing intentionally, is I'm really challenging the age group that I am writing to. I have had a 10-year-old come up to me and said they read this book and they got most of it. But I know they were forced to read things that they didn't fully understand yet. And actually, I think that's really commendable. And I think because the pictures carry the story, you can get the full story, even without digesting every single piece of it. So, to that end, putting the more detailed narratives of history and myth in a way that is skippable and approachable later, I think, again, that welcomes a younger reader to the text more easily.
And well, I wanted to say for our listeners out there who are not adolescents, I'm an adult, and I love the book. I think it's a wonderful book for adults. To me, it doesn't seem like, it's not like you're talking down to children. It's a book that you can sit and read no matter how old you are.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you said that. I certainly don't think the way you write for children is to write in a way that is overly didactic and sing-songy. So, yes, I think this easily tracks with adult audiences because basically I'm taking children seriously in the text.
And every one of your ideas, you have a visual metaphor for it, like the ancient tree of tales.
Mm-hmm.
And you say every leaf and branch is exquisitely fashioned and they're all interconnected and they're nourished by the rich cauldron of story. I love it.
Thank you. Yeah, that's one of my favorite pages in the book. And I like visual metaphors. I'm similar to Lewis in that way. His writing is very evocative, and for me was very evocative as a child because he did use so many metaphors that were extremely visual. I highlight one in the author's note about the meditations from a tool shed, where he talks about looking at a beam of light versus being inside of a beam of light. And these kind of little examples from your own experience has a way of crystallizing abstract concepts, in this case, like, God or joy or faith or things that don't really have a noun associated with them. So in this story, I really did try to put images to concepts just as a way to make them more graspable.
The structure of your graphic novel is, of course, J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis are characters, so you've illustrated them. And that's a big part of the novel, your graphic novel. And then you have these two other characters, Mr. Lion and the Wizard. And they're essentially narrators who step outside the story. So, in a sense, there's two separate narratives flowing along. How did you decide to create these two avatars that you call Mr. Lion and Wizard? Why didn't you just have the whole thing be about C.S. Lewis and Tolkien?
Well, that came up early on in the project, and it really is because the Inklings, including Lewis and Tolkien, basically sat around and talked to each other, right? They are visually extremely dull. Like, in terms of a graphic novel, and I actually do depict several instances of them talking, talking and walking, talking and drinking beer. But you can't have 224 pages of that. So the Lion and the Wizard allow us to go on some adventures and to remove ourselves from the story a little bit. So Lion and Wizard get to give us some meta commentary, and we get to ride a dragon. We get to go on a dungeon crawl. We get to go through magic portals. We get to see the landscape of their minds in visual terms. And again, these are things that, honestly, I just want to draw. So when I start a book, I'm thinking like, I'm going to spend a long time drawing these pictures. What do I want to make? And, I came up with these characters as a way to enter the story, both narratively, but also visually.
You created a fantasy world of your own, and your fantasy world is about myth. Yeah,
That's right.
The fantasy world of myth. And you have these graphic images. You have the mountains, you have the castles, you have the magical trees.
I had this theory of like, we have seen Middle Earth and Narnia illustrated dozens of times and beautifully illustrated. And there is actually a third thing that Lewis and Tolkien subcreated together, a third fantasy world, which is kind of the fantasy world of the Inklings. And that has never been illustrated. And that is what I wanted to illustrate. And frankly, I mean, I'm a professor. I long for a literary life shared with my friends in dark pubs reading poetry. And I don't do that twice a week with my friends. And on some level, they created this longing for that shared intimate life among your fellows that is extremely romantic, almost as much of a fantasy world as Narnia and Middle Earth, at least in my daily life. So that was kind of my desire for this project, was to give that a visual world.
You mentioned the Inklings twice. Could you tell us what that is? Who are the Inklings?
Yeah, the Inklings was their reading group and fellowship group. It was certainly centered around the core fellowship of Tolkien and Lewis, but came to include many other luminaries over the years. Charles Williams, notably Barfield, the poet Adam Fox. There were many, Warney, Lewis's brother, Christopher Tolkien in the later years, Hugo Dyson. There were many people that came in and out of this circle. And actually, in some ways, this was male only fellowship was the tradition of the era post World War I. But Dorothy Sayers really should have been included in this group. She was someone they all admired. And anyway, in this reading group, they met twice a week, generally Tuesday mornings at Bird and Baby at Eagle and Child for, beers at 11 a.m. That's a good practice. And then Thursday night, typically they would meet in Lewis's quarters at Magdalen College and would bring something to read. And they would read to one another their works. And it was this was not the Mutual Admiration Society. They really took swings at each other's work, sharpened one another, occasionally hurt each other's feelings. But Warney Lewis said to read before the Inklings was to face a howitzer with a pea shooter. So it was an extremely competitive and robust arena for criticism and encouragement. So yes, they did that for nearly, 20 years, basically.
Do you mean that they would share their manuscripts, the drafts of the stories they were working on?
Yes. Famously, there were some. There's very few. They didn't keep minutes. I mean, this is a huge tragedy when you think about it. They did not really have many records of some meetings, but there was one I talk about in the book where they shared very significant passages together, all in the same room. Tolkien read so much of Lord of the Rings that Hugo Dyson famously said one time when Tolkien pulled out another chapter of Two Towers, he said, "Oh God, not more elves." So there was, and that hurt Tolkien's feelings, and Lewis had to encourage Tolkien to continue reading. So they got to know one another's work quite well over the years.
A lot of us think that writing is a very solitary activity, and you're describing something quite collaborative. Do you think that this collaboration, the Inklings, did it contribute to the creativity of their books?
So it's an interesting question. In fact, scholar Dana Glyer has written an entire book about this called Bandersnatch. And that title comes from Lewis, a letter that he wrote that said, "No one could ever truly influence Tolkien. You would sooner influence a Bandersnatch," from Lewis Carroll. And I think what he meant was like, what Tolkien needed was not influence or criticism. I think what Tolkien needed was encouragement. He was such a perfectionist. He was such a reviser. He was a robust world builder, but he needed someone to just be truly a fan and to say, you should keep going with this. And Lewis was that to him. I mean, that was the gift that Lewis gave Tolkien, was just simply, he loved being read to out loud. At one point early on in their friendship, when Tolkien shared the Lay of Leithian, which is kind of the emotional heart of the Silmarillion, with Lewis, he wrote a 14-page commentary about it. He was so enthralled and enlivened by it. So that was the gift that Tolkien got. And Lewis also got a gift from Tolkien, and that was the sort of bridge from cynicism to joy. And that was the way to read the human story through a lens that made stories make sense to him. And that was, for him, the Christian story.
So they gave each other quite a few comments, right? And you said it wasn't a mutual admiration society. I guess that means they could be very critical. What did they say? That you have too many elves?
Yes. Very famously, in the first draft of Lord of the Rings, there was so much what they called Hobbit talk. The first few chapters were just much longer. And what Tolkien loved was all the sort of Shire gossip. And he just wanted to kind of live in the Shire. And the story just didn't take off. It was just meandering around the Shire. And so, this is a place where he was influenced, where Lewis said, let's get to the story. But of course, Tolkien didn't know what the story was at that point. He had no idea. He was writing a sequel because the publisher said you should write a sequel to The Hobbit. And he had no sense of what these hobbits were going to do now until he met the Dark Rider. And even then, he did not know what the Dark Rider was interested in and why the ring was so interesting to him. So Tolkien was discovering the story as he wrote it, believe it or not.
This sort of writing sounds like just a lot of fun. And I mentioned earlier that there's research showing that children and adolescents do create these fantasy worlds themselves. So they're having a lot of fun doing it. And they're sharing twice a week where they also are writing for a reader. So what were they trying to accomplish for the reader of their stories?
Well, Lewis himself says about literary criticism in his book, An Experiment in Criticism, he says that we should use authors' intentions and the authors themselves not as a spectacle, but to use them as spectacles, to look through what they were seeing and what they were looking for in their work. And so I think what Lewis and Tolkien were doing was to trying to give their audience a window into the thing that they were seeing in stories which they loved, which was that transportation, that, as Tolkien said, a joy that escaped the walls of our own world, as poignant as grief. Tolkien even came up for his own word for what this was in a story. A great story has this thing called a eucatastrophe, which is the opposite of a catastrophe. It's sort of the moment in the story when there is maximum loss and defeat, and then maximum return, maximum success, and whether it's resurrection or the coming of Gandalf at Helm's Deep on the third day, the eagles, the sort of thing that was never counted on to occur has occurred, and suddenly the story has this joyous turn. And that little flickering of your heart when you read that in a story, Lewis described it as the German word Sehnsucht, a longing for longing. That thing was the thing that they were trying to point the audience to in a story. And they wrote, I think, entirely chasing that feeling.
On page 95 of your book, The Mythmakers, you have a wonderful quotation from Tolkien, and I'm going to read the quotation. "Myth is an invention about truth. We write myths because our hearts were written by a myth maker."
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I think he was distinguishing the truth and fact, right? Like, myths are not quote unquote fact, but they are true, right? And this is why he said that, basically he convinced Lewis about the meaning of Christianity being real, because we had read all these myths as humanity, of years and years of myths. And when finally the myth came true, we could point to it and be like, there it is. There is the truth actually becoming fact. Before, it was truth without fact, and now it is fact with truth, right? And so that little key, Tolkien did not convert Lewis, but that was a key in the lock that gave him enough of an opening to give him basically a theological justification for imagination and for storytelling being enshrined as not a waste of time, as not like juvenile escapism, which is what the criticism of fairy tales were at the time. The serious adults should not be wasting time on dragon stories and fairy tales. These were the things that children outgrew as they got older and read serious prose and verse.
You spent 5 years writing this wonderful book, or I should say illustrating and writing. Both. And you're already a famous illustrator. You mentioned illustrating for the New Yorker. You could do anything you wanted. So why did you choose this project for 5 years instead of all the other things you might have done?
Yeah, this is the hardest thing. When people ask me what's the hardest part of your job, this is it. I have lots of ideas. Again, it's not really, quote, having an idea for a project. It's which idea am I going to invest 5 years in or whatever. So getting to the point where you come up with something that really enlivens your heart and mind, that is hard. And the only way I know how to do that is to take an idea that I love and to kind of test it out, to test drive it a little bit, make a little drawing about it, make a little comic about it, see if you can get your kind of heart to spin up some of the excitement that you're hoping that a project will generate. And sometimes you do have a lot of options. And sometimes you send them to the editor, and the editor tells you what is going to be a viable project. But in this case, this was one that I really, really took to my publisher and said, this is what I want to do. And this is why I think it works. And in the language of publishing, they need an audience too. You can't just make a passion project. These books are 224 full color books on gorgeous paper and beautiful end bands. They're just expensive things to make. So you got to come up with a clear concept, and then you got to come up in the trade world with an audience. And so in this case, lots of people know Lord of the Rings and Narnia, and maybe even lots of people know about Tolkien and Lewis, but very few people know the full story of just how rich their fellowship was and how essential their friendship was to the completing of these stories, which in my mind totally altered the course of the 20th century.
It is truly a beautiful book, The Myth Makers, and it's going to be beautiful on your coffee table. You won't want to put it on your shelf.
Yeah, that's right.
You'll want to keep it out. And so are you saying that 6 years ago or 7 years ago that you had several other ideas and that this was the one you found was just really compelling?
Yeah, that's right. The current project I'm working on for my next long form graphic novel is a retelling of the Salem witch trials, which I flirted with for a while, and I found a way into it that made me really excited. And that's another one where I think people think they know that story, probably because they've read The Crucible or they read Scarlet Letter, but it's just way weirder than you think. It's way scarier than you think. It will never be fully solved in my mind, like what was going on there. And anyway, I'm just excited to bring people into that story through the lens of a graphic nonfiction book.
I'm really looking forward to seeing that one as well. And, hopefully it'll come out a month before Halloween, right? As a Halloween present.
Well, it'll probably be 10 years from now, but yes, yeah, it'll get there eventually.
Well, John, thank you so much. We're coming to the end of our time, and I always like to end by asking, do you have some advice for our listeners, something they could do in the next week or so that might enhance creativity?
Yeah, as a teacher, I'm always working with students about how to make drawing or ideas not a separate part of your life, but an integrated part of just your day. And I always tell people to carry a sketchbook and make it small and portable, have a pen you like, and learn to record things about your day. Even if you're not what you would think is a good drawer, don't think of drawing as making a beautiful artifact, but as visualizing your thinking. And if you can do that a little bit every day, 10 minutes, where you make a little diary comic about something unusual that happened in your day that you want to record, that is a really healthy practice. And it's a way where you can turn a sketchbook into this sort of repository of ideas. And that's how you generate creativity that's sustainable in your life.
And it could be something really small, just a tiny notebook, right?
That's right. That's better than something bigger. You want something you can keep on you.
John Hendrix, thank you so much for being on The Science of Creativity.
Thanks a lot.
I learned a lot from my conversation with John Hendrix. To prepare for this interview, I read The Myth Makers, and it really blew my mind. If you're a fan of C.S. Lewis or J.R.R. Tolkien, you really should buy this book. I have to admit, I've never read a graphic novel from beginning to end, but with this one, I just couldn't put it down. The pages are each beautiful illustrations. Each page is a work of art. For many of the pages, I just stopped reading and I admired the artwork for a few seconds before I turned the page. It actually took me longer to read this book than reading a book that was only text on the page. Maybe that's because this is a story about the creative process. It's a collaborative creative process of two of the greatest authors in the English language, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. Thank you for listening to The Science of Creativity. If you liked this episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast, and please rate the show because that helps others like you hear about the show. Please write in the comments if you have requests or ideas for future episodes. I'll see you next time on The Science of Creativity for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention.